Hi and welcome to my talk called Technology and Principles in Language Teaching. My name's Hugh Deller and I'm a coursebook writer for National Geographic Learning and the co-founder of lexicallab.com. So, technology in language teaching. Technology won't replace teachers, but teachers who use technology will replace those that don't. That's what I was very confidently informed by an ex-colleague of mine about 10 years ago. Possibly, given the fact that you're listening to this talk at a conference where maybe there are other technologically oriented talks in supply. Some of you may even share her evangelical faith, while maybe there's possibly a few of you in the audience who believe that actually technology will eventually replace all of us. We live in a strange time. We live in a time in which teachers are regularly pigeonholed as digital non-natives or digital illiterates, and British Council inspections here in the UK often comment negatively on the lack of technology that they witness in classes, both within class and outside class in the classrooms, irrespective of whether or not the teaching they saw is good or without really commenting on how they believe technology might actually enhance the classes that they've actually seen. The general attitude seems to be, you're not using technology, therefore black mark. What I'm going to try and do in this talk is to question these ideas, to critique them. And I should begin by stressing that I'm not doing this out of any inherently anti-technological tendencies. I'm very interested in technology. I've just been setting up a website. I'm in the middle of writing apps. I'm looking at doing online teacher training courses. I'm very, very interested in how technology can facilitate good practice. But what I am going to try to do is to consider technology and to question some of the ideas behind technological teaching as a way to consider general principles of teaching, both with technology and without. And I hope also by doing this, I hope to be able to support any good low-tech teachers or no-tech teachers who may be out there. I know there are still many. So what I'm going to try to do is to make 6 main points. The first point I'll be making is this idea that using technology in and of itself means neither good teaching nor bad teaching. And in a sense, the discussion about the rise of technology has detracted from any further discussion of principles, and I think this is a problem. I'm also going to be suggesting that technology has created a burgeoning cult of the amateur, and that the pseudo-democratic rhetoric that this has facilitated has the potential to ultimately backfire on all of us. Technology, one of the things that technology has done is it's ushered in a wave of so-called authentic texts, videos from YouTube, websites, newspaper articles, and so on. And I'll be arguing that this isn't necessarily a good thing. Fourthly, I'm going to move on to ponder the problem of price. Now, even if you believe that technology and content can be welded together well, and I do, the issue of who pays for this and how is a huge one, I think. Next up, I'm going to be suggesting that technology isn't inherently motivating, and that if any of you out there believe it to be so, then you may well be better off developing other, broader approaches to motivating your students. And nor, sadly, is technology any kind of magic bullet. It will not cure all our students' ills. It can never hide the harsh reality that there are no shortcuts in language learning and language teaching. And finally, I'll be suggesting that while I think we do need to find ways of increasing interactivity in the classroom, interactive whiteboards, the optimistically named interactive whiteboards, are not necessarily the solution. I then hope to round everything off with an overview of some principles that I think can aid and assist our pursuit of high-tech classes, but which can also be used to justify the non-use of technology as well. So, let's begin at the beginning. And let's just really start by stating that simply using technology does not mean good teaching. And in the same way, not using it does not mean bad teaching. Bad teaching can be delivered using technology. The tech-obsessed teacher that provided me with my opening quote was, I'm afraid, on more than one occasion actually described by students in feedback as cruel. Cruel's quite an achievement to be described as. I've heard teachers described as slow or a bit boring, but to be described as cruel is really something else. I know from my own experience of teacher observation that classes can quite easily suffer slow death by PowerPoint. I've seen classes slog through incredibly poorly graded YouTube clips. And I've seen plenty of examples of students interacting with technology in the classroom, but not with each other. I think we have to accept that positive interactivity is in no way technologically dependent, and actually, technology can even get in the way. The bottom line is, for all of us, that we are language teachers, and we should, by definition, ensure that first and foremost it's language that we're teaching. We shouldn't be teaching digital literacy because it's a life skill, any more than we should be teaching cooking or financial regulation and management. Teaching language to help students use Facebook or to send texts is our role. But I don't think there's any essential need for us to be using the technology, any more than there is for students to actually make dinner in order to learn language for talking about cooking. Part of the problem, I think, at the moment is that the vast bulk of new technologies for English language teaching are based on an old and, I would argue, discredited theory of language. As we shall see, a lot of the sites that have been recommended over the years by gatekeepers such as Russell Stannard and Nick Peachy focus very much on grammar rules and lists of single words and their meanings. A classic example of this is lingro.com. For those of you that don't know it, initially it sounds quite seductive. It's a website that allows you to drop in web articles, and it provides a kind of online dictionary to help you decode the texts that you drop into Lingro. You can then keep a record of any new words you encounter, and the site will even make these basic little single word games for you to test yourself. Sounds great, right? Well, let's look more closely. As you can see here on this page, this is a page from The Guardian that I dropped into Lingro. The dictionary works on a very basic single word level. In fact, the dictionary doesn't even recognise phrasal verbs, let alone collocations or chunks. And on top of that, the definitions are bad. They're poorly graded, they're hard to decipher, and as with withdrawal here, incredibly unhelpful. You got this headline, Obama pledges not to delay Afghan withdrawal. Now, maybe you don't know the word withdrawal, so you look it up, and the first definition is receiving from someone's care what one has earlier entrusted to them. What? Usually refers to money. Okay, not that then. So number 2, a type of metabolic shock the body undergoes when a substance, usually a toxin such as heroin, to which a patient is addicted is withheld, sometimes used with the substance as modifier. Right, okay. Number 3, an act of withdrawing. So, clear as mud. Students need a decent learner's dictionary just to decode the kind of explanations that they meet here. And once they've done this, they then need to grasp that none of these definitions are actually correct or helpful. So, as you can see, clearly not a shortcut to any kind of linguistic competence. Another classic example of these kind of problems is a site called Snappy Words, which I first encountered in a talk by Russell Stannard. Snappy Words is marketed as a simple, quick, visual alternative to traditional dictionaries. You don't even need to log in, You just go to the site, you enter a word in the search box, and this web of related words and definitions and phrases is created just for you. You double click on a word and you drag it to a new location, and you can then explore other branches of the word web. Hover over a word, any word, to view its definition. Again, the hype, the publicity sounds great, doesn't it? But, again, a closer look reveals serious issues. Say the students decide to explore the word people. Well, here's what they would get, okay? Confused? Not as confused as your students would be. Apparently, if you follow the red arrows here, we learn that people is in the same usage domain, whatever that means, as pocket and peoples, okay? Somehow, enemy, damned, retreated and homebound are all attributes of people, whatever that means. And then there's the thorny issue of what on earth peanut gallery means and what on earth it's doing here. Are we really saying that our students are better off spending half an hour a day here than they would be reading graded readers or doing vocab exercises from some of the many really decent books written for language learners? Now, whether it's intentional or otherwise, there are hints of a theoretical view of language implicit in these kinds of sites. And I think the view of language that you see in the vast majority of sites available for learners are these. Grammar and vocabulary are seen as being separate. Usage is seen as being unimportant. Lexical sets abound. You often just get 50 things that you find in a kitchen, all the different parts of a car, that kind of thing. Skills are seen as being at least as important as language itself. There's this idea that learning has to be fun. You can't be learning unless there are lights and flashing things and moving things and colours and animation. There's a very restricted view of language and usage inherent in these sites. And I think it's often predicated on a desire for and a focus on what might be termed as creativity. Now, technology fits this well, obviously. These sites also fall into the trap of believing that more means better. And I think as teachers, we're kind of suckered into believing this as well. Here are 56 vocabulary exercises that my students could do online. They're fun, they're free. Surely if my students do them all, they'll get better, won't they? Well, not necessarily, okay? Because part of the problem is that anyone can write this stuff and stick it online. It's what Andrew Keen in his great book in 2007 referred to as the cult of the amateur. And indeed, it's this two-way relationship, this reciprocity, which is at the heart of the Web 2.0 experience. Web 2.0 blurs the boundaries between user and creator. And as a result, all manner of material is written, uploaded, then downloaded and used. Even sites that we maybe tend to think of as being more reliable often feature material that's clearly neither been edited nor critiqued. Take a lesson that I saw being taught last summer at a summer school I was working on. A couple of summers ago, thinking about it. It was a lesson based around the royal wedding, okay? And I'll show you the headline. Have a quick think, maybe discuss with your partner next to you. What level, from the headline, what level would you say this lesson is suitable for? Royal wedding passes without a hitch as Kate and William seal it with a kiss. What level do you think? Well, actually, the lesson was tagged as being from elementary to advanced. I saw a teacher do it with a pre-intermediate class and I thought it was much too difficult. This was just the headline. You can imagine what the rest of the text was like. And when I challenged the teacher about this and said, it seemed a bit hard to me, the teacher said, well, check on the website, right? Look, elementary to advanced. despite the fact that the headline and the article were chock full of very sophisticated language. This was actually taken from a Macmillan site, I think called English 365, was it? And the principle that seems to be at play here is that level is not dependent on language, but rather on the tasks and the skills that learners develop to deal with the texts they're presented with. You know, the idea is don't grade the text, grade the task. And as we've seen with the online dictionaries that are available for students, there's just this kind of creeping amateurism that's infecting all areas of our profession. Now, of course, you may think none of this matters. You may think that the cream will float to the top. But such a view, I think, is at best naive. At best, what all of this picking and mixing and matching of all these different available sources leads to, at best, is a lack of course coherence, an absence of inbuilt grading and recycling, a bittiness, a poverty of materials, all in pursuit of a magical dream, the dream of free course material, infinitely malleable and tailored to each individual teacher's and student's needs. But seriously, let's get real here. A book with the staying power and the influence of, say, Headway, whatever you think of it, this kind of book will never be free. There's far too much labour and craft and research and skill and investment that goes into any kind of course book for them ever to be gifted away. And maybe we'd all do well to be more appreciative of what we have while we still have it. Every year, dictionary sales continue to plummet, and more of us seem to be happy to rely on these kind of amateur, online, plagiarized, knockoff wiki dictionaries. And if this continues and we stop buying real dictionaries and just use the kind of appalling online dictionaries that you've seen already in this talk, we inadvertently run the risk of killing off real lexicography for good. So, just to sum up this part of the talk really, while dictionaries and corpora, and to some extent even course books, focus on the most frequent words and collocations in the language, and on how these items are used, web sources, on the other hand, are ungraded, where the vocab tools either give no indication of frequency or else lead students to learn vocabulary that's unsuitable to their level. Furthermore, I think the pressure for currency, for contemporaneity, for something fresh, means that teachers are often just downloading these lazy, poorly written, template-based exercises, rather than using materials which have been professionally crafted for language learning. Limited training also often means unfocused use of web sources, and all of this results in bad learning. So, just to summarise, I think this cult of the amateur that the internet facilitates can undermine expertise, it can undermine the publishing process, it can undermine course coherence, and it can undermine language and learning principles. Phew. So, of course, this focus on grammar rules and grammar words plus skills isn't new, of course. It's one of the reasons, I think, why the web has been embraced. When your focus as a teacher is primarily on grammar rules, then interesting contexts and variety become more important than probable usage. When skills are separated from language, any text that someone deems interesting will do, irrespective of the language it contains within it. Practicing skills becomes the goal. But, as Jim Scrivener suggested at IATEFL Glasgow a few years ago, doing things in class is not the same as teaching. And I fear that all too often, for too many teachers, the internet is just an infinite range of stuff to do. One final point to make is, just because a text is taken from the internet, it's not necessarily any more useful or real or motivating or authentic than a text written specifically for language learners. Way back in the 1980s, Henry Widdowson, Guy Cook, and all of those guys were already questioning this dominant view of authenticity that exists within English language teaching. And I would argue, as they argued, that a specially written text that supports language learning and that promotes discussion, such as those often found in course books, can be at least as authentic to learners as something that's been sourced online before tomorrow's class. And maybe, rather than thinking about texts as authentic or inauthentic, we'd do better to think about how to get the class we're teaching to authenticate the texts that we're using. If you're using texts to teach language in a language classroom, that's an authentic use. I think we also need to consider the degree to which the language we're focusing on and that comes up out of the texts we're looking at is reusable, is relevant to students, both in terms of frequency and in terms of the outcomes that we're trying to help the students achieve. Does the text we're providing students give the students the opportunity to exchange ideas and feelings around it? Does it encourage them to relate to culture and or diversity? Finally, do they get the chance to authenticate or personalise the language that's been taught in the text? If so, fine, all is good. And that can mean a text from a course book, it can mean a text from the internet. But I think these are much more important questions to be asking ourselves than, is it from a course book or is it real and from the internet? So, let's move on to consider time and cost. Sadly, I think all too often, time that's invested in researching new sites or apps or tools to use, time that's spent setting things up on them and running them, which may of course also involve training your students how to use them, is very much the teacher's own time. I was at Spain TESOL a couple of years ago and I saw a young teacher do a presentation about blog projects that she'd been doing with her class. And when she was questioned at the end, she admitted that she only found time to do all the astonishing work she'd been doing by sitting up late every night and working weekends. It may well be that these Herculean efforts were met with enthusiasm and gratitude by her students, but I would argue that actually they set an unhealthy precedent. The schools start to take it for granted that motivated teachers will do this stuff in their own time. The teachers themselves set high standards that they'll have to continue to match time after time in order to get repeat satisfaction from students. And colleagues who don't want to invest these hours in technology are made to look bad by comparison, or even more insultingly, they're labelled technologically illiterate. We need to be really clear and vocal as a profession about the fact that in order to use technology, teachers need to be trained and we need to have time to practice. Writing good material takes time and developing expertise takes time. Extending student learning outside the classroom, sadly, all too often leads to an extension of the teacher's working day. And all too often, I think, advocates of technology appear to be more or less workaholics who are happy to do all this kind of thing for free. But are we really saying that a good teacher is only one who's prepared to work overtime for free? On top of all that, I think there's an issue of use in the classroom time. As I'm sure you're all aware, time's often needed to set students up with technology and to get things running. Technology breaks down and things take time to fix. And I think all too often these issues are underplayed in discussions about the use of technology in teaching. And I would just argue that we need to be asking whether this precious time could not be put to better use. So, let's just look at a concrete example rooting all of this in teaching reality. How many of you out there are familiar with Jing? Jing basically captures whatever you choose to show on your desktop as an image or as a short video. It allows you to comment on it and then it allows you to share it. My co-author, Andrew Walkley, was experimenting last year with Jing as a way of giving feedback to his academic English students. And I'll just show you a quick example of the kind of thing that Andrew was doing. Oh, bear with me 1 minute. Where are we? Yeah, here we go. Okay. Bear with me. You see, the dangers of technology. Everything takes so long to boot up.
Introduction. Here, because of the internet has received, you just need a because of is followed by a noun. Here you'd say has received much attention in the media, a huge amount of attention in the media due to its tremendous growth in both customers and business. In this case, you need to say a network term called search engine marketing was coined, was invented to define any kind of marketing using search engines. However, attention in society sounds a bit strange. You'd say, however, much debate, there has been much public debate about the business community's consideration of the ethics of this new medium. And here there is still an enormous consideration of uncertainty. No, there is still an enormous debate. There is still some controversy. There is still much uncertainty about the potential ethical issues associated with its use of marketing medium. This one should be the adjective or ethical issues. Also, here, never don't use for the number, write it out. And then finally, we would normally talk about a particular type of marketing being banned or limited in some way. Okay, this part, in some ways.
Okay, I'll stop there because you get the idea of what I'm saying, yeah? Now, you could argue that this way of giving feedback or receiving feedback from the student's point of view has the added advantage of giving students listening practice. But, is it really better than giving written feedback? According to Andrew, it was certainly more work for the teacher. Yeah? Andrew told me that basically he had to read the student's written work through, then he almost had to kind of script what he was going to say before recording it, because otherwise he'd find himself rambling, and he'd often run out of the short period of time that was allowed him by the program. And even once he recorded it, of course, as with written feedback, there's no guarantee the students would listen to the jing you've sent. There's no guarantee they'll make notes based on what you've told them. There's also no guarantee they'll understand what you've told them or be able to spell the words they hear. What might perhaps work better with Jing is feedback on exercises that students will actually access and re-access over years. This means that any initial hard work that you put in getting the feedback recorded will be more worth it as time goes by, because over the years it becomes a resource which stands the test of time. And I'll show you an example. When I was working at University of Westminster, before they made me redundant, one of the things we were doing was we set up a whole load of classroom homework material for students doing English for academic purposes, and students had to choose words from the academic word lists, and they had to choose the correct forms, okay? And we wanted to give feedback that was more than just the correct answers. So for example, in question 1 here, in order to the relative efficacy of the tree treatment, we undertook a double-blind trial, and they have to choose assessment or assess. Whichever one they click, they get this feedback. Assessment is a noun, so you make an assessment, complete a full assessment, a partial assessment, etc. Assessed is an adjective, an assessed piece of work. Now, ideally, we'd like to record the response feedbacks, okay? I think it would be a good thing to record on. It would be reusable, it would be quite controlled, it would focus on more than single words, and, you know, possibly if you do this kind of thing, it also provides good examples to teachers of how they themselves could discuss language in class. So far though, basically what happened before we were made redundant was we wrote most of the questions and we scripted the feedback, but we just didn't have time to record the Jing versions. And that was despite being fairly proficient with the technology. So, you know, even when you think of good uses for the technology, you don't necessarily have time to be able to implement all of those things. So, I'd like to move on to the idea that technology motivates students. We're often told that we're teaching screen ages, but actually I think our students are only screen agers when they're using Facebook to sort out meetups with their friends, or when they're posting comments on recently uploaded photos. They're not screen agers 24/7, 365. And interestingly, there's been some recent research that questions even our most basic assumptions about the so-called net generation. There was a report last year funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and Dr. Christopher Jones from the Open University claimed that there was no clear link between the use of technologies for social and leisure purposes and the ability to use them for educational purposes. And nor is there a clear link between universal technological services and the ability to use the particular services that students are required to engage in at university. Essentially, being able to use Facebook doesn't necessarily mean you'll be able to effectively search for a journal article. The things most students do in their social lives don't translate necessarily into educational contexts. Some people have argued that the use of technology is motivating in itself, but the fact of the matter all too often is that students won't use tools or learn online unless it's assessed. Okay? When I was running my MA TESOL modules, we had online discussion boards, and we used to encourage teachers to participate on the discussion boards. The first question was always, do I have to do it? Is it assessed? And unless it's assessed, most teachers won't do it. There's also obviously no evidence to suggest that the students who do make use of technology wouldn't have been motivated anyway to use non-tech solutions to learn in their previous pre-tech lives. Motivated students are motivated students, full stop. Okay? Regardless of this, I think students do still need to make time to study if they're to learn. And we have a responsibility to ensure that they're aware of this. Learning words from a notebook, a paper book, it's no more or less easy than learning them on a mobile. The choice still needs to be made to sit and learn words, as opposed to doing something more pleasurable or more urgent. And actually online or on a mobile, maybe there's more distractions, more temptations to not do the hard study. We might also ask why students come to class at all if technology really is so motivating. Why not just skip class, stay at home and use technology? I would suggest it's because students actually want to set time aside to learn. They want to have guidance on how to learn useful things, and they want to have the opportunity to exchange their ideas and feelings in English. So, let's look at another oft-touted technological tool that supposedly makes vocabulary learning more fun. One moment, I'm going to have to pause, I'm afraid. My son's crying upstairs. Give me a minute to pause the video, okay? 1 second. How do I pause? Technology. Give me a second. I can't see how to pause. 1 sec. Pause recording. Right, sorry about that, I'm back. This is the problem of recording technologically at home. You get small screaming children who disrupt you and take you away from your work. So where was I? Yeah, I think what I was talking about was just the fact that, technology doesn't actually make it necessarily easier to learn in any kind of way. You still have to sit there and make the effort to learn. I'm going to just look quickly at one often touted tech tool that supposedly makes vocab learning more fun. Okay, obviously there are lots of these kind of sites out there, but this was one of the first ones I came up against. Supposedly this sort of makes gamification, it's called, makes things easier and more memorable. And what you can see here in this slide is one of the games that Lingro produces for its learners. And you don't need to be a genius to realise very quickly it's all single words with all of the attendant problems associated with single word learning. And it doesn't take Einstein to realise that essentially this exercise is just double-sided cards. You can see it sort of English to Spanish translation. Even within all the limitations of these confines, the confines of these limitations, these words still have to be learned. You still have to sit there and take the time to learn them. And in many ways, I think actually the old paper cards are actually easier and more flexible to use. You can add more examples, you can add in pronunciation from a good dictionary, you flip them over on the bus and so on. In a sense, your kind of traditional paper cards are more open to customization. Obviously, with some sites now, like Quizlet or Anki or whatever, there is a bit more flexibility built in there. But, not necessarily any better or any easier to learn from. I think there's also the fact that making things easier for students doesn't necessarily mean that it becomes any easier to actually learn the language. Okay? And in fact, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the increased use of the internet is in many ways hindering our efforts to learn better. There was a study in 2011 by a woman called Betsy Sparrow from Columbia University who claimed that Google is altering the way our memories work as we increasingly recall location rather than content. I don't know, but I know where to find out. Now, there may be advantages to this in some fields, but in language learning, this is clearly disastrous. A similar kind of article was by De Stefano and Lefebvre, who in 2005 did some research into reading, and they found that students reading articles online scored significantly worse than those reading old-fashioned paper versions, both in terms of recall of content and also in terms of noticing the actual language that's being used. And they argued that this may well be down to the fact that hypertext serves as a distractor and it kind of increases the cognitive load. Every time you're reading online and you see a hyperlink, your brain has to make a decision about whether or not you're going to click and go down that rabbit hole. And sometimes you do click and you go off to different places and then you come back and you've forgotten a little bit more about what you read. So I think we just need to be wary, I suppose, of assuming that fun and easy necessarily equals better and more effective. Finally, I think there's the myth that technology necessarily makes our classrooms more interactive. The great hope has been that the optimistically entitled interactive whiteboards will facilitate greater interactivity. Yet, far too often in the classes I observe, IWBs are simply used as a giant held-up coursebook, as another form of crowd control. Ultimately, interactivity in the classroom has to happen between teachers and students and among students themselves, not through technology. Partly we can achieve this by asking interactive questions. Okay? Look, for instance, at some language here. This is all language from an exercise from Outcomes Upper Intermediate on social issues, one of my course books. I think as a teacher, when you're checking the answers to these kinds of things and you're asking things like, what else can you describe as non-existent? What happens when there's a recession? What else can you undermine and how? What else might there be a shortage of? What else could boost a country's standing? What could damage a country's standing? When you're asking these kind of questions and listening to what comes back from the students, you get real insight, real humour. You get banter, you get comedy, and you get plenty of real opportunities for teaching and learning to occur. So, there you go. This to me seems to be where we're currently at. And if you're happy with the status quo, then fine. But things don't have to be this way. I'd like to suggest that rather than worrying about whether we're using tech or whether we're non-tech teachers per se, we'd do well to first consider what our basic principles as language teachers are, and to then use technology or to reject technology accordingly. Sorry about the background noise, by the way. I think one of my neighbours is letting the water out of their bath, and that's what you can hear in the background here. It's all go and excitement tonight. So one way you can think about principles, okay, is to look at the Common European Framework. The Common European Framework suggests some eminently sensible core principles for language teaching, as you can see here. Basically suggests that we need to teach towards the business of everyday life. We need to help students exchange ideas and feelings, and we need to understand other cultures better. In addition, as teachers, we need to define worthwhile and realistic objectives. We need to base our teaching and learning on the needs, characteristics and resources of our learners, and we need to develop appropriate methods and materials. Now, when it comes to principles for learning, I would argue only 5 steps are basically compulsory. You need to understand the meaning of new language. You need to notice new language, both the form and the way things are used. You need to hear new language, or at least see it. You need to do something with it, and then you need to repeat these steps again and again and again and again and again. Now, this leads us onto core principles for thinking about teaching language. Okay? And these are my core principles. You can take them or leave them. You may agree with them. You may have different ones. But if you do, I think it's important that you make them explicit. For me, I believe that seeing examples of real usage is important. I believe that grammar and vocabulary are interdependent, but that actually ultimately, in the long term, vocabulary is more important than grammar. I believe that better skills ultimately come from better knowledge of language. I believe that students' wants, needs and current abilities should define level, not some prepackaged canon of grammar. I believe that frequency and thought about desirable outcomes should determine vocabulary input, not just convenient lexical sets. And out of all of this emerges a kind of mission statement about teaching. When I was still at the university, I helped to develop a mission statement to define the university's ethos for language teaching. And this is what we came up with. We believe classes should be language rich. We believe the language we teach should be useful. We believe in using our students as a resource wherever possible. We believe in encouraging the exchange of ideas, thoughts, feelings and opinions. We believe in helping students to recognise and understand diversity. And we believe in making links to continued learning, which of course may involve using technology, helping students continue their learning outside of the classroom. And finally, this just brings us to some principles for the use, or of course the non-use of technology. Okay? I think the focus first and foremost in any class has to be on the outcomes that you're trying to achieve and the language that you think it'll be necessary to teach in order to help students achieve those outcomes. And it may be that technology facilitates that and improves that journey. It may be that you decide there's a better way of getting there. Okay? I think we need to leave space for our students, okay, to ask questions, to explore, to interact with content and with language. We need to consider technology, but we also need to be asking ourselves if a non-tech way might not be better. And finally, I think, right across the profession, we need to be shouting loud and clear that we do not want workaholics to be our model. And whether you realise it or not, there is more to life than teaching. On that happy note, I'll leave you. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. I'm sorry about the disruption and the slight chaos surrounding the recording of it. If you do want to contact me, please just email me. It's hugh@lexicallab.com. Okay? You can also check out our website, www.lexicallab.com. Thank you very, very much for your time and for your attention. Okay? And enjoy the rest of your conference.